Rain fell in soft sheets over Haldren's Reach on the morning of the choosing, washing the dust off the training yards and turning the colony's metal walkways into dark mirrors. Nobody minded the weather. Once a year, the whole colony gathered to watch a clutch of dragon hatchlings pick their bonded partners for life, and rain had never stopped anyone from showing up. Eli Turner stood at the very back of the cadet line, half hidden behind two taller boys, hoping nobody would notice him. He was thin for his age, with tired eyes and a habit of looking at the ground when people spoke to him. Most of the colony knew his story already. His parents had died in a raider strike when he was 7, and he had grown up in the colony's shared dormitories, quiet and mostly forgotten. He was not the kind of cadet anyone expected a dragon to choose. The academy hall was packed. Rows of benches held families, instructors, and colony officials, all facing the wide stone floor where the hatchlings would be released. At the front sat the cadets most people were watching, especially Owen Voss, tall and confident, already treated like a future hero even before any dragon had chosen him. Instructor Grant Halden stood near the hatching crate, arms crossed, watching the crowd with the patience of a man who had seen this ceremony many times before. Beside him, Director Ren Castillo checked her data slate, already thinking about patrol schedules and border reports, treating the ceremony as one more piece of colony business to get through. The crate opened, and the hatchlings spilled out onto the stone floor. They were small, clumsy, wobbling on new legs, chirping at the crowd and each other. One by one, they moved toward the front rows, drawn to the strongest, tallest, most promising cadets. A golden-scaled hatchling walked straight to Owen and pressed its head against his knee, and the crowd cheered. Another chose a girl from the engineering track, and another chose a boy known for his sharp shooting scores. The pattern made sense to everyone watching. Strong cadets got strong dragons. Only one hatchling remained in the crate, smaller than the rest, with deep blue-green scales that caught the light strangely, almost like sea glass. The other hatchlings had been eager and quick. This one moved slowly, sniffing the air, turning its head this way and that, as if searching for something specific rather than choosing at random. It ignored the front rows completely. The small dragon walked past Owen, past the girl from engineering, past every cadet the instructors had quietly marked as promising, and kept walking. Murmurs spread through the crowd as it crossed the entire floor, claws clicking softly against stone, heading toward the back of the hall. It stopped in front of Eli. For a moment, nobody moved. Eli looked down at the hatchling, certain it had made some kind of mistake, certain it would turn around and walk back toward the better cadets. Instead, it tilted its head, studied his face with round golden eyes, and pressed its small snout against his hand. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through parts of the crowd. Someone near the front muttered that the runt had picked the reject, and a few cadets snickered. Instructor Halden's jaw tightened, though he said nothing yet. Director Castillo lowered her data slate, frowning slightly, already running through the paperwork this unexpected pairing would create. Eli barely heard any of it. All his attention was on the hatchling now curling against his leg, warm and trusting, as if it had known him for years instead of seconds. He crouched down slowly, unsure what he was supposed to do, and the dragon climbed straight into his arms, tucking its head under his chin with a small, satisfied chirp. "That's the run of the clutch," Halden said quietly to Castillo, stepping closer. "Smallest hatchling we've had in years, slow to hatch, slow to grow. I had doubts it would bond with anyone at all, let alone choose on its own." "And it picked him," Castillo said, glancing toward Eli. There was no scorn in her voice, only calculation, the sound of someone already wondering whether this bond would be worth the resources needed to support it. Whispers followed Eli as he carried the hatchling off the ceremony floor, arms wrapped carefully around the small, warm body. Owen watched him go, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. He did not laugh like some of the others. He simply watched, as if trying to understand something that did not fit the pattern he expected. Outside the hall, the rain had softened into a light drizzle. Eli sat down on the cold steps, still holding the hatchling, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was disappearing into the background. The little dragon shifted in his arms, opened one golden eye, and let out a soft, rumbling sound, almost like a question. "I don't know why you picked me," Eli said quietly, more to himself than to the dragon. "Everyone thinks it's a mistake." The hatchling blinked slowly, unbothered, and pressed closer against him, as if the opinions of the crowd meant nothing at all. Whatever doubts the colony had about this pairing, the small dragon clearly had none. It had crossed an entire hall full of stronger, more promising cadets to find him, and it did not look like it planned on changing its mind. Somewhere behind them, the ceremony continued, other cadets receiving their dragons with cheers and applause. Eli barely noticed. He was looking down at the small, strange creature in his arms, already feeling something he had not felt in years. He was not alone anymore. 3 weeks after the choosing, Eli learned that dragons snore. It was a small, ridiculous discovery, the kind nobody warns you about, but it made him laugh out loud in the empty equipment shed where he had been given space to keep his hatchling. The small dragon, now named Rook after the dark towers that guarded the colony's outer wall, was curled on a pile of old blankets, making a soft rattling sound with every breath. Eli sat nearby, sketching notes in a battered notebook, trying to record everything he was learning about his strange new partner. Nobody else seemed interested in what Rook could do. While other bonded pairs trained in the main yard, running drills, practicing formations, and building the kind of neural link that let dragon and rider move as one, Eli and Rook were left to figure things out mostly alone. Instructor Halden checked on them occasionally, mostly out of duty, and offered clipped instructions before moving on to cadets he considered more worth his time. "He's small," Halden said one afternoon, watching Rook attempt a short, wobbly flight across the shed and crash softly into a stack of crates. "Might stay small. Some hatchlings do. Don't expect miracles." Eli nodded and said nothing, though something in his chest tightened at the words. He had already heard enough doubt to fill a lifetime. He did not need more from the man in charge of training him. What Halden did not see, because he rarely stayed long enough to look closely, was the way Rook's eyes tracked movement long before anything actually happened. During one training exercise, a loose cable snapped free from an overhead crane and swung down toward a group of cadets. Rook shrieked a warning half a second before it happened, giving Eli just enough time to shout and pull two younger cadets out of the way. Nobody thanked him. Most people assumed it was luck. Eli started keeping a private log of these moments. Rook could sense changes in air pressure before storms rolled in. He flinched away from certain training chemicals long before their effects were announced. Once, during a sedative gas drill meant to teach cadets how their dragons would react to being calmed in an emergency, every other hatchling in the yard grew sluggish and sleepy within seconds. Rook barely reacted at all, shaking his head like an itch rather than falling into the expected daze. "That's not normal," Eli murmured, checking Rook over carefully afterward, running gentle hands along his scales the way the manuals described. Rook simply chirped and nudged his hand, as if to say he was fine and Eli was worrying too much. Owen Voss found them like that one evening, sitting outside the shed while Rook practiced short bursts of flight between two fence posts. Owen's own dragon, a broad-shouldered creature with bright golden scales, was already twice Rook's size, already capable of carrying a rider short distances. "You're out here a lot," Owen said, not quite friendly, not quite unkind either. "Nobody else wants the yard time," Eli replied, watching Rook land clumsily and shake himself off. Owen studied Rook for a long moment. "He's fast for his size, faster than mine was at that age." Eli blinked, surprised anyone had noticed anything about Rook besides his size. "He notices things before they happen, storms, loose gear. That gas drill last week, he barely reacted at all." "Huh?" Owen crouched down, careful not to startle the smaller dragon. Rook eyed him warily but did not back away. Maybe he's not slow, maybe he's just different. It was not exactly kindness, but it was not mockery either, and Eli found himself holding onto the comment longer than he expected. That night, lying on his cot with Rook curled against his side, he thought about what Owen had said. Different did not have to mean weaker. It just meant nobody had figured out what Rook actually was yet. He began training in secret after that, waking before dawn to run drills in the empty yard before the other cadets arrived. He taught Rook simple commands using the neural bond, small pulses of intention that grew stronger the more they practiced. Rook, for his part, seemed to soak up every lesson eagerly, as if he had been waiting for someone to actually try. Progress was slow and often frustrating. Rook was still smaller than every other hatchling in the program, and his flights rarely lasted more than a few seconds before he tired. But his reflexes sharpened by the week, and the strange instincts Eli had noticed early on only grew stronger. He began reacting to danger before Eli himself noticed anything wrong, nudging him out of the way of falling equipment, growling low in his throat moments before a training alarm sounded. One quiet morning, as mist clung to the training yard and the sun had not yet fully risen, Eli stumbled while running a drill course, twisting his ankle badly on uneven ground. Before he even registered the pain, Rook was there, small body pressed protectively against him, wings half spread, teeth bared toward the empty yard as if daring anything to come closer. Nothing was there. No danger, no threat, only Eli's own clumsy misstep. But the reaction told him everything he needed to know. Whatever Rook lacked in size, he made up for in something else entirely, a fierce, immediate instinct to protect the one person who had never once looked at him like he was a mistake. Eli sat in the mud, ankle throbbing, and wrapped his arms around his small, fierce dragon. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I believe you." Rook made a low, satisfied sound and settled against him, wings folding back down, still watching the empty yard just in case. The alarm that changed everything was not the one anyone expected. It started as an ordinary Tuesday. Sensor stations along the colony's outer markers had picked up faint traces of raider scout ships, small and fast, testing the edges of Haldren's reach the way they sometimes did before deciding whether a bigger strike was worth the risk. Senior bonded pairs were dispatched immediately, dragons and riders lifting off from the launch platforms in tight formation, while the rest of the colony went about its day under a thin blanket of tension. Eli watched them go from the ground, standing beside Rook near the training yard fence. Neither of them had been asked to join, not even as backup. Instructor Haldren had made it clear weeks earlier that Rook was not yet cleared for anything beyond basic drills, and Eli had learned not to argue. He busied himself instead with maintenance chores around the shed, checking gear, cleaning training equipment, anything to keep his hands moving while his mind wandered to the skis. It was well past midday when the ground shook. The sound came first, a deep, grinding groan from the direction of the secondary training dome, followed almost immediately by a cloud of dust rising above the rooftops. Eli's stomach dropped before his brain even caught up. The training dome was where younger cadets practiced structural drills, climbing exercises meant to build strength and coordination among dragon and rider teams still too young for real missions. Rook was already moving, ears flat, wings half spread, letting out a sharp, urgent cry that Eli had never heard from him before. Without thinking, Eli ran toward the sound, Rook close behind him, weaving between startled colonists who were only just beginning to understand something had gone wrong. The dome had partially collapsed. One of its support struts, weakened by age and stress nobody had caught in time, had given way, bringing down a section of scaffolding and trapping several cadets beneath twisted metal and broken stone. Dust hung thick in the air, and faint cries for help echoed from somewhere inside the wreckage. A small crowd had already gathered, along with 2 colony maintenance workers trying desperately to figure out where to even begin. The senior bonded pairs were too far out on patrol to respond in time, and the dragons still in the colony were either too young or too large to safely navigate the tight, unstable gaps in the wreckage. Eli did not think, he acted. "Rook in," he said, pointing toward a narrow gap between two fallen support beams, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, let alone a full-grown dragon. Rook did not hesitate. His small size, the very thing that had made him a target for ridicule since the day he hatched, let him slip through the gap with ease, claws finding purchase on unstable debris that would have collapsed under anything larger. Eli followed as close behind as he could, calling out to the trapped cadets, following the sound of Rook's low, urgent calls as the dragon pushed deeper into the wreckage. They found 3 cadets huddled together in a small pocket of open space, protected only by a slab of fallen scaffolding that had somehow held despite the weight pressing down on it. One of them, a younger boy Eli recognized from the mess hall, was pinned by a beam across his leg, pale and struggling to stay calm. "We need to move fast," Eli said, crouching beside them. "The whole thing could come down further." Rook squeezed into the small space beside them, sniffing at the beam pinning the boy's leg, then pressing his shoulder against it with surprising strength for his size. Eli added his own weight, straining until the beam shifted just enough for the boy to pull free, crying out in pain but finally freed. Getting all 3 cadets back through the narrow gap took careful, frightening minutes, Rook leading the way, sensing which parts of the wreckage were stable enough to bear weight and which were not, guiding them like he somehow already knew the danger before it revealed itself. By the time they emerged into daylight, coughing dust and blinking against the sudden brightness, a proper rescue team had finally arrived, along with Instructor Halden, breathless and pale with worry. He stopped short at the sight of Eli and Rook emerging from the wreckage with 3 rescued cadets, one of them being carefully carried by 2 maintenance workers toward a waiting medic. "You went in there," Halden said, half question, half accusation, though there was something else beneath his tone, something closer to shock. "Nobody else could fit," Eli said simply, still catching his breath, one hand resting on Rook's trembling shoulder. Halden studied Rook for a long moment, taking in the dust coating his small blue-green scales, the exhaustion in his posture, the way he still stood protectively close to Eli despite clearly being spent. Whatever doubts he had carried since the choosing did not vanish entirely, but something in his expression shifted, a crack in the certainty he had held for weeks. Among the small crowd that had gathered, Owen pushed forward, having heard the news and run straight from the launch platform. His eyes went first to his injured friend being loaded onto a stretcher, then to Eli and Rook, both trembling but standing. "You pulled them out," Owen said quietly, not quite believing it. Eli only nodded, too tired to explain further. That evening, as Rook slept curled tightly against him, worn out from the day's effort, Eli allowed himself, for the first time since the choosing, to believe that maybe the little dragon had not made a mistake after all. Static filled the comm room 3 weeks later, and with it came a silence far worse than any alarm. A routine border patrol, 4 bonded pairs sent to check the eastern markers of Haldren's Reach, had missed their scheduled check-in by nearly an hour. Attempts to reach them returned nothing but broken signal and interference, the kind raiders often used to blind colony sensors before an ambush. Director Ren Castillo stood over the comm station, arms folded tightly, watching technicians scramble to boost the signal with no success. "Jamming," one of the technicians confirmed grimly. "Something is scrambling our range out past the ridge line." Every available bonded pair capable of combat was sent out within minutes, spreading across the eastern terrain in overlapping search patterns. Hours passed with no results. The jamming made coordinated search efforts nearly impossible. Dragons and riders forced to rely on old-fashioned sight and guesswork across dense, unfamiliar terrain. Eli watched the search teams return one by one at dusk, exhausted and empty-handed, the patrol still missing. "Rook," Now noticeably larger than he had been at the choosing, though still smaller than most dragons his age, paced restlessly near the shed, ears twitching, head constantly turning toward the eastern hills. "You feel something," Eli said quietly, watching him. Rook let out a low, urgent sound, one Eli had come to recognize over the months as more than simple restlessness. He crouched down, resting a hand against Rook's neck, focusing through the neural bond the way he had practiced for weeks. What came back was not words, but impressions, a pull toward the east, faint but unmistakable, like a thread tugging at the edge of his mind. He ran straight for the command building. Instructor Halden was there, along with Castillo, both poring over incomplete maps, arguing quietly about whether to risk sending searchers out again after dark. Halden looked up as Eli burst in, breathless. "Rook can sense them," Eli said. "Not exactly where, but a direction. He's been pulling toward the east ridge since the patrol went dark." Halden's expression was skeptical, but exhaustion and desperation had worn down his patience for doubt. "That's not a documented ability." He sensed the gas drill wasn't affecting him the same way as the others, Eli pressed. He sensed the dome collapsing before anyone heard it crack. "I think he can sense bonded pairs, maybe over long distances, in a way that cuts through the jamming." Castillo exchanged a long look with Halden. The colony's official search patterns had failed for hours. She had little left to lose. "Take him out. Stay on comms as long as the signal allows. If you find anything, you signal immediately and wait for backup. You do not engage." Eli nodded, already moving before she finished speaking. The flight east was rougher than anything they had attempted before, Rook pushing through gusting wind and failing light, guided by that same faint pull Eli could feel humming at the edge of his thoughts. The jamming grew stronger the closer they got, calm static swallowing anything Eli tried to send back to base, until eventually the signal cut entirely. They found the missing patrol pinned in a narrow ravine as full darkness fell, Raider scouts positioned along the high ground, keeping the four bonded pairs trapped under sporadic weapons fire. The dragons below were too exhausted and too boxed in to break free, their riders hunched behind rock cover, waiting for an opening that had not come. Eli's stomach turned cold at the sight, every instinct telling him to turn back for real reinforcements. But comms were dead, and every passing minute meant more danger for the pinned patrol below. He weighed the risk for only a moment before deciding. "We draw their attention," he told Rook through the bond, feeling the dragon's fierce agreement rush back to him. "Just enough to give them an opening." Rook dove low along the ravine's edge, faster and more agile than the raiders expected from something his size, weaving between rock outcroppings as weapons fire chased after them. It was terrifying, every shot far too close, but it worked exactly as Eli hoped. Raider attention shifted upward and outward, away from the pinned patrol, just long enough for the trapped riders below to break cover and scramble their dragons into the air. The escape was chaotic, panicked shouting mixing with the roar of wind and weapons fire, but it held together. Rook led the fleeing patrol back along the ravine, staying just ahead of pursuit, using tight turns and sudden drops that larger dragons could not easily follow. By the time they cleared Raider range and reconnected with comms, alerting base to send proper reinforcements, both Eli and Rook were running on nothing but adrenaline. They landed back at Haldren's Reach well past midnight, met by a stunned crowd that had gathered once word spread the missing patrol was safe. Eli slid off Rook's back and immediately dropped to his knees beside him, checking him over with shaking hands, a deep gash along one wing from a Raider shot that had come far too close. Halden reached them first, kneeling to examine the injury himself, his earlier doubt entirely gone from his face. "You shouldn't have engaged," he said quietly, though there was no real anger in it. "You could have both been killed." "I know," Eli admitted, voice hoarse with exhaustion, "but nobody else was close enough." Halden looked at Rook for a long moment, at the wound along his wing, at the fierce, protective way, he still leaned into Eli despite the pain. Whatever remained of his doubt from the choosing finally, fully, gave way. "Get him to the medics," Halden said, helping Eli to his feet. "Both of you did well tonight." It was the first time anyone in the colony had said those words to him, and Eli held onto them the entire walk to the medical wing, one hand resting steady against Rook's trembling side. The warning came at dawn, painted across every screen in Haldren's reach in sharp red text. Multiple large contacts, inbound, eastern approach. This was not a scout ship testing the border. Long-range sensors had picked up a raider fleet larger than anything the colony had faced in a generation. Dozens of vessels moving in tight formation, closing distance far faster than the evacuation teams could prepare for. Sirens rolled across the colony in long, mournful waves, calling every bonded pair, veteran and cadet alike, to the defense line. Eli was already dressed and moving before the second siren finished, Rook waiting for him outside the shed, wings half spread, tension radiating through the bond between them. The wound from weeks earlier had healed into a thin scar along his wing, a reminder neither of them needed of how close danger could come. The defense line formed quickly along the colony's eastern ridge, dragons and riders spreading into practice formations under Director Castillo's rapid instructions. Civilians moved toward the shelter district, herded by ground crews, while every available bonded pair took to the skis to meet the incoming fleet. Instructor Halden found Eli and Rook near the edge of the formation, checking their positioning with a critical eye that had, over the past weeks, become something closer to respect than doubt. "Stay with the second wave," he said. "Rook's speed will matter more once the fighting gets close and chaotic." Eli nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly as he tightened his harness. Nothing in the past months, not the collapsed dome, not the ravine rescue, had prepared him for the sight now filling the horizon. Raider ships broke through the morning clouds in staggered waves, weapons fire already lighting the sky as the first line of colony dragons met them head-on. The battle that followed was loud, chaotic, and terrifying in a way Eli had never experienced. Bonded pairs wove between raider fire, dragons roaring as they clashed with smaller attack drones sent ahead of the main fleet. Owen's golden dragon tore through one formation with practiced precision, while other veteran pairs fought to hold the line against overwhelming numbers. It was Rook who first sensed the trap. Through the bond, Eli felt a sudden, sharp warning, distinct from the general chaos around them. A pull toward the southern flank where a smaller group of colony pairs had pushed too far ahead in pursuit of retreating raider drones. Eli barely had time to process it before understanding hit him, cold and immediate. "It's a trap," he shouted toward the nearest comm relay, urging Rook into a sharp turn. "They're being pulled south. There's a second wave waiting to flank them." The warning reached Castillo just in time. Reinforcements diverted south, catching the hidden raider wave before it could spring its ambush, saving at least two bonded pairs who would otherwise have been surrounded. It was not the last time Rook's strange instincts proved sharper than the colony's own sensors that day, catching shifts in raider movement moments before they became visible threats. But the real crisis came when a breakaway group of raider ships, faster and smaller than the main fleet, slipped past the ridge formation entirely, diving low toward the colony itself, straight toward the shelter district still packed with civilians. Every senior pair was locked in combat too far out to respond in time. Castillo's voice crackled across the comm, tight with barely controlled panic, calling for anyone close enough to intercept. Eli felt the words land like a physical weight. He and Rook were the closest. "We can't outfight them," Eli said, voice unsteady, watching the raider ships grow closer, weapons already charging toward the shelter district below. Rook's answer came through the bond, not in words but in fierce, unshakable certainty. They did not need to outfight them. They only needed to slow them down. Rook dove hard, faster than Eli had ever felt him move, weaving directly into the raider formation's path, forcing evasive maneuvers as ships scattered to avoid collision. It was reckless, dangerous, exactly the kind of maneuver only a smaller, more agile dragon could attempt, using tight turns through narrow gaps between buildings that larger raider ships could not follow. Weapons fire chased them through the colony's outer streets, close enough that Eli felt the heat of near misses against his skin. Rook twisted and dodged, buying precious seconds, disrupting the raider formation just enough to throw off their attack run toward the shelters. It was not a permanent solution, only a delay, but it was enough. Reinforcements arrived moments later, Owen's golden dragon leading a small strike team that finally broke the breakaway raider group apart, driving the survivors back toward the retreating main fleet. The battle ended less than an hour later, the raider fleet withdrawing under heavier losses than they had expected, unwilling to push further against a colony that had fought back with far more coordination and ferocity than anticipated. Cheers rose across Haldren's reach as the last raider ships vanished from sensor range, though exhaustion tempered the celebration for those who had actually flown that day. Eli landed shakily near the shelter district, Rook trembling beneath him from exertion, wings scraped and singed but intact. Civilians who had huddled inside the shelters emerged slowly, blinking in the daylight, some of them recognizing the small blue-green dragon that had drawn raider fire away from their doorstep. Owen landed nearby moments later, sliding off his own exhausted dragon, expression somewhere between disbelief and pride. "You flew straight into their formation," he said, shaking his head. "Alone." "He knew we could make it," Eli said quietly, resting a hand against Rook's heaving side. Owen looked at Rook for a long moment, then extended a hand toward Eli, something that felt less like pity now and entirely like respect. "Good flying, Turner, both of you." Eli shook his hand, too tired to fully process the moment, though somewhere beneath the exhaustion, something warm settled into place. The colony was safe, and for the first time nobody was calling it luck. 3 days after the raider fleet withdrew, Haldren's Reach held a ceremony in the same hall where the choosing had taken place months earlier. The rain had cleared this time, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, catching on the polished stone floor where hatchlings had once wobbled toward their future partners. Eli stood near the back again, out of old habit more than anything else, though this time people kept turning to look at him rather than past him. Rook stood beside him, fully recovered from the battle, scales gleaming a deeper blue-green than they had at the choosing, his frame no longer quite so small compared to the other dragons filling the hall. Director Ren Castillo addressed the crowd first, speaking about the fleet, the losses avoided, the shelters that had held because of pairs who fought to protect them. She spoke of coordination, courage, and the unexpected instincts that had turned the tide during the worst of the fighting, though she did not need to say a name for most of the hall to know exactly who she meant. When she finally did call him forward, Eli felt Rook press gently against his side, urging him on, and he made his way to the front of the hall for the first time since the day he had been chosen. "There were many acts of courage during the attack," Castillo said, her voice carrying easily across the quiet hall. "But few pairs did as much with as little support as Cadet Turner and his dragon. Rook's instincts saved multiple bonded pairs from an ambush before it happened, and their intervention at the shelter district likely prevented significant civilian casualties." Applause filled the hall, warm and genuine, nothing like the quiet laughter that had followed him out of this same room months earlier. Eli stood still, unsure how to hold himself under the weight of it, until Rook nudged his hand, grounding him the way he always did. Instructor Grant Halden approached afterward, once the formal part of the ceremony had ended and the hall had loosened into quiet conversation. He looked older somehow, though only months had passed, the weight of the recent battle still lingering behind his eyes. "I misjudged you," Halden said plainly, no excuses offered alongside the words. Both of you. I looked at his size and assumed weakness. I looked at your file and assumed you'd wash out within the year. I was wrong on both counts, and I should have paid closer attention sooner." Eli did not know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, and Halden extended a hand, which Eli shook, feeling something settle between them that had not been there before, something closer to genuine respect than obligation. Owen found them shortly after, no longer wearing the careful distance he had kept in the early months. "Command's talking about restructuring the advanced training track," he said, leaning against the wall beside Eli. "Word is they want you and Rook leading some of the scouting exercises. Something about instincts nobody else's dragon has." "I don't know the first thing about leading anything," Eli said, though the idea did not feel as impossible as it once might have. "Neither did I at first," Owen said with a shrug. "You figure it out." Over the following weeks, the colony slowly rebuilt what the raider attack had damaged, repairing outer walls, restocking supplies, mourning those who had not made it through the fighting. Life in Haldren's Reach returned to something like normal, though something had shifted permanently beneath the surface. Cadets who had once ignored Eli now sought him out for advice on bonding, on reading their dragon's instincts, on trusting a partner even when the rest of the world assumed the bond had been a mistake. Rook, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by the sudden attention, more interested in stretching his wings across the training yard each morning, growing stronger and faster by the week, closing the gap between himself and dragons who had once towered over him at the choosing. He still curled against Eli every night, still reacted before danger fully announced itself, still pressed protectively close whenever something felt wrong. But there was a new confidence in the way he moved now, earned rather than simply hoped for. One evening, weeks after the ceremony, Eli sat on the same steps outside the academy hall where he had first held Rook as a hatchling, rain long since cleared, stars beginning to appear over the colony's outer walls. Rook settled beside him, larger now, but still choosing the same close, familiar space against his side that he always had. "You picked me when nobody else would," Eli said quietly, resting a hand against Rook's neck. "I still don't fully understand why." Rook made a low, contented sound, nudging closer, offering no explanation beyond the simple, steady presence he always provided. Perhaps there had never been a complicated reason. Perhaps he had simply seen something in Eli that everyone else, including Eli himself, had been too quick to overlook. Somewhere beyond the colony walls, the wider dangers of the frontier remained, raiders regrouping, unclaimed space stretching out into the unknown, threats that would eventually test Haldren's Reach again. But for now, sitting beneath a clearing sky with Rook steady and warm beside him, Eli felt something he had not felt since losing his parents all those years ago. He felt safe, he felt like he belonged. And somewhere in the colony, cadets were already whispering a new version of an old lesson, one that had taken an unlikely pairing to prove true. Sometimes the fiercest protectors are not the ones anyone expects, but the ones who choose to stand their ground anyway, especially when nobody else believed they could.